Pre-install planning and ISA server installation. Imagine this. You're sitting in your cubicle in what seems to be a normal work day, and suddenly the package arrives. Oh, it's the one you've been waiting for. The rack mount, quad processor, RAID 5 configuration, Windows 2000 server platform. You're going to install ISA server on this one so that you can access the internet for everybody inside of your company. But is it enough? I certainly hope so. But in this nugget, we're going to identify what hardware and software it's going to take to start setting up this ISA server. We're then going to go through the pre-installation tasks and considerations. For example, did you know that when you install the ISA server software, instantly your internet access is gone from that server and anyone in your company that is going through that server to access the internet? You have to open it up before it will allow access. We'll talk about that. We'll also look at the installation modes you can choose. We'll look at the local address table, which can be one of the most confusing terms in the ISA server software platform. We'll explore what that means. We'll look at how proxy server upgrades take place. Does proxy server work on Windows 2000? Not exactly. And ISA server doesn't work back on NT4 either. We'll talk about that. Finally, we'll go through anything that could go wrong and may go wrong during your ISA server installation and how to fix it. But let's start at the beginning. What is the minimum hardware and software required to install the ISA server? Will that quad processor machine cut it? I certainly hope so. Minimum processor is a Pentium 2, 300 megahertz or faster. Now do remember that this is a minimum. It's not an excuse to pull that machine out of the closet you never thought you'd use again to run the ISA server, because it will run very slowly. Memory, 256 megabytes. Hard drive space, 20 megs for the ISA server install, and plus your cache storage space. Now it's not uncommon for this to run into the gigabytes of storage space. Depending on how big your network is, that will directly affect your cache storage space on your hard drive. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. What other requirements? Well, it does require an NTFS partition for caching. You can't use a FAT partition to do this. You do need to have two network interface cards, one attached to the external network, which is the internet, and one attached to the internal network. Now, in a lab environment, is it possible to simulate this? Maybe not even having any network cards. It actually is, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later in this nugget. Finally, Windows 2000 Service Pack 1 is required in the software for ISA server to install. Now, the software does perform a check on this, so if you don't have it, it will abort the installation process. The final note is if you do plan on installing ISA server into an array, meaning you have those centrally managed policies that are applying to all the ISA servers in your network, you need to have Active Directory installed. Now that doesn't mean that your ISA server has to be a domain controller. Don't get that mixed up. It does mean that you do need to have Active Directory running on your network, because that will be where the policies are stored and where the ISA server will look to find those policies. Now that we've seen the minimums, let me give you my suggestions as to what you would use in your business. If you had less than 500 users, my suggestion to you is that you would have no less than 512 megs of memory and a processor that ranges somewhere in the 800 to 1000 megahertz with 20 gigabytes of hard drive space for cache storage. Now, if you have a small business, could you get by with less? Sure. 10 to 50-ish users could definitely get by with less memory and hard drive space for the caching. But these are just my suggestions. 500 to 1,000 users, I would suggest 1 gigabyte of memory, 1000 megahertz plus processor, depending on what you have, and 40 gigabytes minimum of hard drive storage. If you have 1,000 plus servers, now I've split it into two servers. Have two ISA servers, each one having a gigabyte of memory, each one having 2 gigahertz processor or more, and 80 gigabytes of hard drive space. And this is my suggestions. If you don't have something that meets this, it should work okay. But the bigger you can get, the more you're helping yourself, because it will give you faster response times and faster internet access. Let me drill down into what you really need to understand about the hardware. The more hard drive space you have, the more cached files you can store, which means your server needs to go out to the internet less. The faster your processor, the faster it can process the packets going through. That helps not only your caching side, but your firewall side as it analyzes each and every packet and figures out what to do with it. Memory allows you to store cached files in extremely fast locations. Normally, a cached internet web page will come from the hard drive, but there's those web pages, you know, the ones that everybody always accesses. Those can be stored inside of the memory, and as soon as somebody accesses it, it doesn't even need to reference the hard drive. It can respond lightning fast from the memory. Okay, some final checks and then we're ready for takeoff. Before you get going with the ISAServer installation, number one, go ahead and grab a CD key. If you bought it, it should be on the back of your CD case. If you are doing a lab environment and you're setting up a test server, Microsoft has a 90-day demo of ISAServer downloadable from www.microsoft.com/ISAServer. By the way, this website is really handy. They give you all the latest and greatest on ISAServer, so you might want to check it out. Second off, you need to decide whether this is going to be a standalone installation or if you're going to be installing into an array. That's going to go into your planning and whether you have Active Directory installed. And really, you'll typically decide on this based on whether you're in a small business environment where you don't have Active Directory, or if you're in an enterprise business where you do have a full-blown deployment. That will really dictate how you install ISAServer as well. The installation mode, you'll have to choose during the install: cache, firewall, or integrated. So have in mind what you would like to do, whether you want to distribute the function between multiple servers or whether you want all of those functions integrated into the same one. Cache size consideration also comes into play. Before you start installing the ISAServer, make sure you have a hard drive or a partition formatted with NTFS, remember that was one of the requirements, that's dedicated for the cache. My recommendation to you is, if you can afford it, grab a second hard drive, a separate hard drive that is on a different controller than your system files. You know, all the Windows 2000 or 2003 system files. Try and keep those separate because there's going to be a lot of access to this cache. And if you combine it on the same hard drive, even if it's on a separate partition as your system files, you're going to be jumping back and forth between your system operation and trying to read from the cache, and it's going to slow down both of them. So overall, you won't have an extremely quick system in either the system side or the response size to your internet requests. So try to get a separate hard drive there. Fifth will be to design your LAT configuration. Now, this we're going to get into a little bit later, but I do want you to have a good idea. Before you start setting up the ISAServer, you should have all of this planned out. The local address table, again, is what LAT stands for. And as we go through the install, I'll go ahead and stop because it'll be copying some files, and I'll explain what the LAT is all about. All right then, I'm ready for some action. Let's set up the ISAServer on this Windows 2000 server system. Now beforehand, I went out to Microsoft's website and I downloaded the trial version of ISAServer, which is actually the full version, but it takes a different CD key, and they'll give that to you on Microsoft's website and also show that to you during the install. Now if you actually order the CD, it will auto-run, but if not, you can double-click the auto-run, and it'll bring up this menu that you see on the screen here. Now, if we were installing into an array, we would start using the ISAServer Enterprise Initialization. I'll talk more about that later. For now, until a later nugget, we will focus on a standalone installation. So I'm going to click on this Install ISAServer link, and it will pop up with the installation window. I'll hit continue, and the demo key, you can get it from Microsoft's website or jot it down now, is 880-289-7414. I'll click OK, and it's recognized, and I'll click OK. We'll go through and check for the installed components, and this is where, if you don't have Service Pack 1 installed, at minimum, it will give you an error message. I'll click on Agree to the license agreement, and it will come up with this typical custom or full installation. Let's go ahead and do a custom installation. I know all of you like seeing that because you get to see all the options. What we have is, first off, the ISA services. This is the minimum. That's the firewall, the caching pieces, that sort of thing. We have the add-in services as well, which is an option to install the H323 Gatekeeper service and an email message screener. I'll talk more about each one of those options in a little while, but for now I'm going to keep the add-in services unchecked because we'll add those in a little bit later. You can always come back and modify your installation options. We also have the administration tools right here, which allows you to administer the ISO server from the Microsoft Management Console. Definitely want to have that one checked. I'll click Continue, and it will go on through the ISO server installation. It will say, this computer cannot join an array for one of the following reasons. It's not part of a Windows 2000 domain, or the schema is not installed inside of the Active Directory, or you don't have permissions to access that schema. That's okay. We're installing it as a standalone, and I actually do have Active Directory installed on this machine, but I did not do that enterprise initialization, which does the schema install. More on that later. I'll click Continue. That's fine. A standalone server works for me. And this is where we have that option. Do we want the firewall, the cache, or the integrated mode? Now, during this entire course, I'm going to work with the integrated mode because that is the one that gives us the most options, and it gives us everything that ISO server can do. If we do want, we can go with one of the individual options to only have it be a firewall or only have it be a cache server. I'll click Continue, and it will stop all the relevant services that are running in the background, like if we're running IIS, that will stop, as you can see right here. It does mention that after setup is complete, you should uninstall IIS or reconfigure IIS not to use ports 80 or 8080. There's a key point. ISO server does intercept both of these ports. So if you did have this running as a web server, guess what? Port 80 isn't going to work for you anymore. You need to move that web server to another machine, or later on I will show you how to configure ISO server so you can have a web server installed on here. You'll just need to modify what port 80 will direct to. I'll click OK, and it will come up with the next screen allowing me to configure my cache. Again, you will only see file systems formatted with NTFS. You will not see any FAT partitions in here, and it will not let you use those for your cache files. This is where you get to set your cache storage space. So how many megabytes do we want it to be? I see that we have 2.4 gigabytes available, approximately, and right now I'm set to 100. Since this is a lab environment, I'll go ahead and increase it to 500, but that's not that big a deal because we're not going to have that many people running through this ISO server install. Now again, using my recommendations I gave you, you would adjust this to the size that you would want, and if you want, at a later time you can always come back and adjust the maximum size. So don't think that you're locked into this, it can never change. I'll just set it to 500 megabytes for now. Right here we have enter the IP addresses that span the internal network address space. Okay, stop here. This is what we call the LAT. The local address table is what the ISO server uses to figure out which IP addresses are internal to your network and which ones are external, meaning which ones are connected to the internet. This is why it's so important, is because it directly tells the ISO server which network it needs to protect and which one it needs to watch for attacks from. Let's imagine this. Let's say that we had a network interface card connected to the internet, and it was assigned the IP address 130.1.1.1. Now we also had a network interface connected to an internal private network. And that plugged into a switch or a hub, and it was connected to 500 internal clients that use your ISO server to access the internet. And maybe those 500 internal clients, I'll represent them by this one PC, have the IP address space 172.16.0.0 with a 16-bit subnet mask, or essentially that's saying 255.255.0.0. Okay? What we would do is we would construct a LAT. We would assign a LAT to the ISO server saying that all of these addresses, meaning any address that starts with 172.16.0.0, is included in the lat. And here's the key point. Everything that you include, and the name gives it away, inside the local address table is considered an internal address. ISOServer will protect those. Do we add this external interface to the lat? No. Would we add any external interface that has real internet addresses to the lat? The answer is probably no. There's some very weird circumstances where we could do that, but overall, we want to just add our private internal address ranges to this lat. Let's go back to the ISOServer installation, and I'll show you what that means. So back in our ISOServer setup window, we're still at that lat configuration screen. In order to fill this out accurately, we need to verify our IP address information that's set up on this server. Now this is a live server connected to a real internet connection, so I'm going to type in ipconfig. And what we see here is that I have an external network interface card and an internal network interface card. And the internal network is 192.168.1.x. Since the subnet mask is 24 bits, this 95 is just the address assigned to my ISOServer. The addresses assigned to the internal clients could be anything starting from 1 up to 254. So this is going to be the range right here, 192.168.1.x, that I assign to my local address table. Now you see I have my external address sitting right here as well, and that is not going to be assigned to the local address table. I'm going to close this out. And right here I'll show you. I type in 192.168.1, and we'll just say .1 is my starting address, to 192.168.1.254. That completely represents my internal range, and it pops over here. Now Microsoft gives us a shortcut. I'm going to remove this, and I'll show you why. We have this construct table button over on the right-hand side. This makes it easy. We have two options. One is we can add all of the private ranges, since Microsoft assumes that we'll be, number one, using a private range, and number two, that these will never be found out on the internet, which they can assume correctly. So we can choose to add all of them, or we can choose to add addresses based on our network card information. You see right here we have the address ranges based on the Windows 2000 routing table. If this is checked, we get to choose the network card that belongs to our internal network, which is this one right down here. This is my external, that is my internal network. I click OK, and right here he says the local address table was constructed based on this information. I click OK, and I see over here all the addresses. These are all private range, 10, 169, 172, 192.0.0, and then it added the one from my network interface card that I selected. Now I could have just added this one for our environment, but we added all of them just to be safe. Just for your information, 169.254 is not an officially registered private address. This is just a range that Microsoft has purchased, and you probably recognize it because it is the one that auto-generates for an interface that's configured for DHCP but cannot find a DHCP server. So Microsoft considers these private ranges as well. So now that I have the lat configured, I can click on OK and let the file copy begin. You'll see it start and stop some services and copy some files. Overall, it takes about 2 to 3 minutes. So while that's working, let's talk about some of the other topics dealing with the ISOServer install. Before ISOServer was a product called ProxyServer 2.0. And it was the same thing as the ISOServer, a firewall and cache server that ran on Windows NT. Now it can still run on Windows 2000, but ISOServer adds improved management, a lot of features that ProxyServer didn't have, so you might want to upgrade. Now if you are performing an upgrade and you're running ProxyServer 2.0 on Windows 2000, it's pretty simple. You just stick in the ISOServer CD and the upgrade takes place during the install. All your settings will move over, except a few. I'll talk about those in a second. So let's make this a little more complex. We'll say upgrading from ProxyServer 2.0 on Windows NT. So let's say you're performing a Windows 2000 upgrade and an ISOServer upgrade at the same time. First step, back up your old configuration, just in case something goes wrong. Second step is to disconnect from the internet. And the reason I say this is because at some point during the upgrades, you're going to be exposed to the internet without a firewall in place. And with all the worms and viruses and just crazy stuff going out there, I wouldn't feel safe doing that. So I would make sure that we had an internet connection disconnected. Step 3 is to stop all the Proxy 2.0 services in the Windows NT Services control panel. Step 4, I have my little asterisk here because this is optional in case you aren't running in an array. But if you are, remove the proxy server from that array. Step 5, perform the upgrade to Windows 2000. Literally stick in the Windows 2000 CD-ROM and perform the upgrade. Now, I'm not talking about blowing the server away, doing a fresh install of Windows 2000, because obviously your proxy server is blown away at that point and your settings will not move over. Step 6 is going to be installing Windows 2000 Service Pack 1 or later. You can upgrade to the latest and greatest Service Pack. You don't need to do any intermediary step. You can use the latest one and ISOServer will be just fine. But at least Service Pack 1 is necessary. Finally, step 7 is to install the ISOServer 2000 and all your proxy settings will migrate over. They will now be applied in Windows 2000 with the exception of your cache files and SOX rules. I know that sounds kind of funny. Cache files is because overall ISOServer uses a totally different caching system, so the cache files won't move over. And you know, overall, by time you upgrade to Win 2000 and upgrade to ISOServer, the cache is probably out of date anyway, so that's no big deal. The SOX rules are used for the WinSock application. Many of you may remember this. The SOX rules are still available in ISOServer 2000, but they're applied and implemented in a totally different way. So you want to reset those up because they will not move over from the Proxy Server 2.0 upgrade when you move to ISOServer 2000. Finally, what to do if something goes wrong. Troubleshooting your ISOServer installation. The #1 biggest complaint that I've heard is administrators and users complaining that they cannot connect to internet resources after your ISA install completes. Again, this one is by design. ISOServer goes against the default Windows 2000 full control for everyone, allow all, and it locks it down. It says, I'm not allowing anybody to access anything until the administrator tells me so, and that's a good thing. #2, an error message of some sort appears during the install. This could happen for a variety of things. A service couldn't stop, you didn't have enough hard drive space, just something went wrong. In that case, the solution is normally to go into the control panel, remove the ISOServer installation using the add remove programs, reboot and have a clean start, and try the install again. Now, here's the trick though. Sometimes ISOServer didn't get far enough in the install to show up in the add remove programs. So what you need to do is go under the i386 directory that ISOServer is installed into. Just imagine that's the root ISA install. / and there's a program called rmisa.exe. That will remove all of the ISOServer installed pieces out of the registry, the files, even if it isn't fully installed. So that'll give you the chance to do a true clean install. #3, users are accessing websites even though you have not defined access rules allowing them to access websites. In that case, the first place I would look is the LAT, local address table. If that's configured incorrectly, it may be thinking that those users are on the outside network, and it may be allowing them access even though they're not supposed to because it doesn't believe they are the internal users. And the final one, after a proxy server upgrade, users cannot access internet websites. Well, you might think, well, isn't that the same as the first one? Not necessarily, because on #4, you may have access rules defined. The main reason why is because proxy used a different port number. Typically, with proxy, you would point your proxy clients to port 80. You would say, go to the ISIS or the proxy server back then on port 80. ISA server changed that port number because 80, as you might know, is the most common one for a web server. So they decided to make theirs 8080 in the ISA server world. So when you configure Internet Explorer to connect through a proxy server and you upgraded from Proxy Server 2.0, you may need to change those client port numbers from 80 to 8080, which is what ISA server uses. Well, it looks like our ISA server install went through without any troubleshooting necessary, and it's giving us the option to launch the ISA management tool to run this Getting Started wizard. I'm going to uncheck this for now because that gets into the ISA management, which will be covered in a future nugget. This Getting Started wizard is a great way that it allows you to walk through a few steps to allow internet access and to set up a lot of the basic features of ISA server. And don't worry, I'll walk you through that when we get to that section. We see here that the Microsoft ISA Server Enterprise engine is set up successfully. We click OK, and we're back to the install screen. Before we leave this nugget, I want to show you a couple of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years of working with ISA server. Number one, make sure that you name your network cards. You can do this by right-clicking on them and clicking on the rename. By default, it's named Local Area Network Connection 1 and Local Area Network Connection 2, and renaming them to something like Internal and External Network is so much easier to work with. Number two, what if you don't have two network cards? Maybe you're in a lab environment and you only have one, or maybe you don't have any at all. Well, there's a way that's a little convoluted, but there's a way to emulate as if you had network cards. I'm taking you to the control panel, and I'm going to double-click on this Add Remove Hardware option, something that we probably haven't used since the NT4 days. We have this Add/Troubleshoot device, and I'll click on that, and it's going to try and search for plug-and-play hardware. It's thinking, oh, maybe I missed something, but it didn't miss anything. I want to manually add a new device that it doesn't really have. I'm going to click on this Add New Device and hit Next. Do I want Windows to search? No, I want to select from the list. I'll click on Next, and it comes up and says, well, what hardware type do you want to add? I scroll down and choose Network Adapters. Microsoft has created a certain kind of adapter called the Microsoft Loopback Adapter that allows me to emulate a network card. And the beauty is, I can add as many of those as I want. Now you'll see all the manufacturers. I'm looking for one, and that is Microsoft. Over on the right-hand side, my only selection is this loopback adapter. I click on Next, and it will probably ask me for the, oh, nope, it didn't. It didn't ask me for the Windows 2000 CD. I click on Finish. Let me go back to my network places, right-click on it, and hit Properties. And look at this. It's just as if I had another network card, and I could rename this, and we'll talk about this option later, DMZ Network. And I can assign addresses to that card. I can ping that card. It's just like a real network adapter, except it doesn't exist. So what did we see in this nugget? Well, the first thing we did was look at the hardware and software requirements. What's it going to take to install the ISA server? We also looked at some of the pre-installation tasks and considerations, things to think about before you go into the ISA server install. We looked at choosing installation mode, and that was mainly during the install. And we looked at the all-important concept of the local address table. You now know what that is and how to configure it. We looked at some of the things to think about when you're upgrading from Proxy Server 2.0. Not everything is the same. And finally, we went through some of the troubleshooting steps of the installation issues. I guess we could add on here tips and tricks as well. Things to make sure you keep in mind to save you some time and a lot of headaches when you're starting to work with the ISA server. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.